Good evening, everyone. We are going to get started with this evening's program, Leaving a Legacy of Land, Conservation Easements. I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Heather O'Bara, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator for Alachua Conservation Trust. I'm also joined this evening by Erica Hernandez, ACT Statewide Land Acquisition Specialist, as well as Melissa Hill, our Santa Fe River Basin Project Coordinator. Melissa and Erica are going to introduce ACT a little bit more in depth this evening. So before we get started, I just have a few announcements for folks, and then I'm going to turn the program over to them. First and foremost, tonight's panel discussion is part of ACT's Keep Florida Wild virtual series. So if you'd like to support future environmental education programs like tonight's talk, you can make a donation by texting Florida Wild to 44321, and we greatly appreciate everyone's support for programs like the one that we're doing tonight. In addition, if someone you know couldn't make it to tonight's talk, or if you would like to watch it again, we are going to have a recording of the talk available on our website at www.alachuaconservationtrust.org/keepflwild. We'll also have a recording of this presentation on YouTube. So if you just search for Alachua Conservation Trust, you can find our YouTube channel, and we'll have a recording there. We're also live streaming to YouTube this evening as well. So if you know anybody who's looking to tune in a little bit later on tonight, they can do so on our YouTube channel. Following tonight's presentation, we will also have a Q&A. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type those into the chat box this evening or the Q&A option. We are not able to unmute anyone's mics, or if you raise your hand, we're not able to acknowledge that this evening. So please feel free to send your questions into the chat, and we will put them in the queue for our Q&A later this evening. So I'd like to just introduce Melissa and Erica, and then I'm going to turn the presentation over to them, and they're going to talk a little bit about conservation easements. Erica Hernandez has served as ACT's statewide land acquisition specialist since spring 2019. She spent her career researching flora and fauna across the state of Florida and earned her master's in interdisciplinary ecology from the H.T. Odom Center for Wetlands at the University of Florida. Erica has served as a public servant for state agencies and public universities for over 20 years, often collaborating on complex projects requiring large stakeholder participation. When not daydreaming about science, Erica can be found foraging for wild fruit or blacksmithing. And Melissa Hill graduated from the University of Florida with a master's in interdisciplinary ecology from the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, and a certificate in environmental education and communication. Since August 2019, Melissa has served as a land acquisition specialist and project coordinator for the Santa Fe River Basin watershed, where she manages a regional partnership and executes conservation easements and land acquisition deals. Prior to 2019, Melissa worked on various ACT projects and previously served as the community outreach coordinator for ACT. On an off day, she can be found catching a sunrise or out paddling. So without further ado, Melissa and Erica, I'm looking forward to your presentation this evening.
All right, great. And I'd like to echo what Heather has said already. Thank you all so much for joining. Give me just a moment. I'm going to share a screen here for a PowerPoint presentation. So hang tight. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. And I'm going to go ahead and kick off this presentation with a quick poll here. So for those of you who are joining on Zoom, you can go ahead and take an answer. And for those on YouTube or joining later, the poll is asking, how did you hear about this event? Some folks received postcards. Some folks may have read about it in our e-newsletter or on our website, as well as our Facebook or some other means, maybe word of mouth. So give that just another 20 seconds here. It seems like most people have had a chance to vote, but it's really helpful for us to know how you hear about these events and what ways you like to engage. So we appreciate you taking the time to answer that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. But it looks like most people found out about the event through our newsletter, our e-newsletter. So if you aren't already on that, you can go to our website and sign up for emails. You get them about once a month. They let you know what events are happening and events like this, as well as other ongoing conservation efforts. So thank you. All right, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Alachua Conservation Trust to you all. I'm sure since some of you are signed up for our newsletter, you are already a little familiar, but I'm sure you might learn something along the way here. So for tonight's presentation, I'm going to do a quick about ACT, and then I'm going to actually pass it over to Erica, and she will cover the bulk of the presentation on conservation easements. She's going to talk a bit about why landowners choose to conserve their land in the first place, touch on some community benefits, really dive into what a conservation easement is, how it works, talk about the nuts and bolts there, and then also give some examples so that way people can visualize how this tool looks on the ground on individual properties. And then, as Heather said, we'll have opportunities for questions after the fact. So, Alachua Conservation Trust, also known as ACT, we are a nonprofit land trust. And land trust is just a special term that means we have the capacity to hold and manage land. Our mission specifically is to protect the natural, historic, scenic, and recreational resources in and around North Central Florida. And we do that by purchasing land directly, we accept donations of land, and we also use conservation easements, which is the point of tonight to talk about. And we do that throughout 16 counties, primarily, I should say, in North Central Florida. And you can see here, there's beautiful state of Florida, and all those counties in blue are the places that ACT primarily works. I should also mention that while that's our focus, where we do the bulk of our conservation efforts, we also do things outside of that region as well. We have some work in St. Johns County and Franklin County, as well as all the way down south in the Keys. So this is where we are based, and our main physical office is located in Gainesville, Florida, in Alachua County. Our organization was founded in 1988, and it is a 501c3 nonprofit. And we have a professional staff of 13 people. On the call tonight, you have 3 of those professional staff members, but we also have, in addition to land acquisition, community outreach, which Heather oversees. We also have professional staff that help with land management. We have about a dozen nature preserves that are completely free and open to the public for people to go and visit and hike and enjoy a lot of different beautiful trails. And so the land management staff oversees that, and they also work with private landowners as well. So it's a diverse organization, but the focus is always conserving and protecting Florida's natural lands. In 2013, our organization received the Land Trust Alliance Excellence Award. The Land Trust Alliance is a governing body that oversees the over 1,000 land trusts all throughout the United States. And of those 1,000 land trusts, we received the 2013 Excellence Award. It's a high honor. And my cheesy joke, I'm sure Erica is very tired of hearing, is that if they could give it out multiple years in a row, we would have gotten it again. But in our time, we've helped protect over 54,000 acres of land, which is really tremendous. A lot of that is due to incredible partners throughout the region, truly generous individuals, and support from individuals like yourselves. And we also have directly participated in the purchase of over 20,000 acres as well. Next slide. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Erica to dive into conservation easements. If folks have generic questions about ACT or any things I talked about, you can definitely put those in the chat feature. We'll get to them later. But for now, we're going to turn into the topic for the evening. So Erica, take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. And while I'm speaking, Melissa might be jumping in there to add or clarify something. So you'll kind of get both of us, hopefully. And so specifically, we're speaking about private land conservation tonight. And you know, there's all kinds of land protection and land protection programs out there, and a majority of land in conservation in Florida is protected by the state, protected by the federal government, national forests, state parks. But what we're talking about is how to keep land private and also have conservation value and protection. And so you can put private land in conservation and keep it in agricultural production. You can keep the land within your family. You can protect important waterways, especially in our area in North Central Florida. We have really vital rivers to the Gulf of Mexico. We have our Florida Spring systems. We have a lot of really interesting and rare wildlife and habitats. And then also we just are maybe interested in protecting a rural landscape. Folks are also dismayed sometimes when you have that residential creep and urban sprawl. And so with that, there's basically this idea that we are all tied to our land. There is a lot of history to our relationship to land. Not all of it is necessarily good, but in recent history, folks are trying to maintain family property whichever way they can. Sometimes folks are forced to subdivide and sell, but that's not always what they would like to happen. And so they might be looking for opportunities to protect the land and its existing resources, or be able to keep managing it for generations. But I would say primarily when we're working with private landowners, what folks are looking for is peace of mind, that something that was in their family for generations or purchased by their parents or grandparents, that they would like to leave a legacy to their heirs, their children, or maybe just protect it as it is and just know that one day it's not going to be turned into condos or a parking lot. And so specifically tonight, we're speaking about conservation easements and what a conservation easement is and how it works and how it might be a tool to help you if you're interested in protecting property. And so if we think about landowner rights, when someone owns a piece of property, they are in possession of that property, they can mortgage it, they can lease it, they could sell it, it can be subdivided, it can be developed, it could have mineral rights that they would choose to mine. And so when we pursue a conservation easements, we look at the conservation value and we look at ways in which a property can be protected to protect that conservation value and come up with some conservation goals. So it's probably very difficult to subdivide and mine a property and then also protect it for conservation. So essentially, when you enter into an agreement with a conservation easement, you are relinquishing some of those rights in favor of preserving conservation goals. Next slide, please.
And actually, before you do that next slide, I'm gonna do another poll, if that's all right.
Oh yeah.
Just to see, before we get started and everyone gets their textbook definition here, just right now at this moment, how familiar would you say you are with conservation easements? So you have not at all familiar as an option, somewhat familiar, quite familiar, and extremely familiar. So go ahead and take a moment to just vote on that. I see people are already chiming in, and it seems that, all right, looks like everyone has essentially answered here, and 60% of people say they are somewhat familiar, 20% say quite familiar. Oh, and we had one person just chime in who said extremely familiar. So thank you all for participating, and hopefully we can all learn something extra here tonight together. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Thank you all for doing that. And I will hit the next slide. Thank you, Erica.
And so essentially, you are entering into a contractual agreement that is 100% voluntary with an organization or an entity that's legally allowed to hold those conservation goals. So essentially, you are relinquishing the right to develop or to intensify property to protect it for conservation. So you're essentially splitting up some of your property rights for a piece of property. And so they can be really flexible at the design side of things. And a conservation easement can be donated, it can be sold. Sometimes there's something called a bargain sale where it's kind of sold at below market value, and then part of that becomes a charitable donation. And there are these wide scopes to kind of consider all these different types of participants, lands, goals, and purposes. But it's still the intent and the purpose of the easement is going to be for this conservation value. And that has to be very clear in this contractual document. And so that conservation easement document, we have templates that help us kind of walk through what are the terms of the easement. As I said before, as a baseline, often some of the initial things are going to be to not subdivide and to not intensify. So if you have a farm with some cows and goats, you're not going to turn it into a dairy with a confined feedlot. Or if you have a home, you're not going to subdivide the property and build 20 homes. And they can be really specific. We have coastal properties that are very specifically for protecting sea turtle habitat, or they can be really broad and just kind of talk about the preservation of open space. And so we have conservation easements in areas that are very sensitive and very vulnerable. And so we'll include language in a conservation easement that points out that what makes this property unique and worth protecting is related to those very specific things on that property. And then also we want to listen to the landowner and understand what is the intention for protecting the property. How, when you protect your property, do you plan to use it in 20 years, in 50 years, forever, to make sure that this is the right fit for you? Because once it's recorded, the idea is that it's forever. A conservation easement runs with the land. So while you're free to sell the property or lease the property, or somebody is going to inherit the property, they will still have to abide by the terms of the conservation easement. And so that is what makes these very, very powerful, is this way to keep land in private protection, private property, but then have that additional layer of conservation that never goes away. Next slide, please. So they are very customizable, but it does also depend on who you're developing a conservation easement with, and if there's any grant funding or purchasing of a conservation easement. So some folks want to donate the conservation easement. It's really important to them that no matter what, this property is protected. They want that peace of mind that after they pass, that property will always be there and nothing will happen to it. But if you are entering an agreement with an agency, for instance, a farm bill program where their priority is to protect farmland, then they're going to make sure that that conservation easement says that the landowner has a right to always farm, and it's going to be very specific about what kind of farming and what the best management practices are. If you're working maybe in an area that has very sensitive water features, surface water or groundwater, you could make a very strong conservation easement that really outlines ways to prevent any kind of nutrient inputs or water use. Again, it can be very flexible. The stronger you make the conservation easement language, the stronger the conservation value, the conservation easement then is actually worth more. But some agencies, if you're requesting funds, will have very specific guidelines that are kind of their template, and that's what you have to work with in the constraints. But the main idea is we're going to probably limit any kind of future subdivision, limit any kind of intensification, but you still, as a private landowner, on the day-to-day, this is your property, this is your home, you use that recreation, and conservation easements actually have the language that address that, that say, you know, this is your private property and you can, do what you need to do in the way that you've always managed your property in the past. And so there's specific language with that. Next slide, please. And so aside from the idea that protecting private property with a conservation easement can give a landowner peace of mind that their property is protected forever, there can be additional benefits. And so that is related to taxes, both income taxes and estate taxes. And then sometimes, as I said, the conservation easement can be purchased. There could be an opportunity for a grant. And so with income tax deduction and estate tax benefits, this is essentially saying that when you record a conservation easement on your property and you relinquish that right to develop or subdivide or build out the property, your property loses value. Now, many of us might feel that the conservation value is the highest and best use of a property, but this is really looking at real estate markets. And so there would be a qualified appraisal, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and they'll estimate this value. And then that value can be claimed as a charitable donation in the future. In the same line, if somebody is inheriting that property, then their estate tax might be less. And then as far as cash payment, some entities might be able to pay for a conservation easement. Sometimes it is a competitive grant opportunity. And actually that's more than likely it's going to be a competitive process because there aren't endless amounts of funding to purchase land or to protect land with conservation easements. And so organizations like Alachua Conservation Trust, we will work with the landowner and apply to grants on their behalf to help them get funding to purchase a conservation easement. Next slide. And so in order to qualify for a charitable deduction for donating a conservation easement or doing a bargain sale, there are very specific criteria that must be met in your conservation easement. And these are in legal statute, they are in the IRS code. Conservation easements are not tax shelters. Some folks, maybe it's important to think about how donating land or donating a conservation easement will affect your taxes, but it's not purely a way to make lots of money per se. And so there has to be a qualified appraisal. In the state of Florida, we have a list that is created by the Department of Environmental Protection at the state level, where they've identified appraisers in the state that have the experience to evaluate land for conservation. If someone is, maybe primarily used to working with real estate and homes and businesses, they may not necessarily accurately estimate the value of land for conservation. And so it has to be a qualified appraisal. And then there are conditions within the IRS code that really, the conservation easement language and the purpose of the conservation easement have to be very clear about why the property is unique and worth protecting. If you try to put a conservation easement on a parking lot and you just said this is open space, the IRS might reject it depending on the specific criteria. So the context of the property, what's around it, what's special about it, all goes into that appraisal. And the appraisal is looking at the market value, it's looking at what's around this area, it's looking at what properties that are similar to it are also being sold for, and then it's looking at that unique, that important conservation value. And there are restrictions on when an appraisal counts because markets fluctuate so much. So typically, if you're trying to do a tax deduction, The appraisal can't be any earlier than 60 days before the date of closing on the conservation easement, so about 2 months. Sometimes folks like to have a qualified appraisal so that they understand the value of the easement, and then they might have to do a refresher on that appraisal before closing. Sometimes appraisals are also done after closing, but they must be done before the tax return for that year is due. Next slide, please. And so when we're thinking about the value of the conservation easement, it's all about the context. And so if you think of your property as that 100% being the highest and best use as far as what could be done with that property, that development, that subdivision, that building out, that is the value of the property. And then the conservation easement is a percentage taken away essentially from that total value, because now if you're recording the conservation easement, you cannot develop, you cannot subdivide, you cannot build it out. Next slide, please. And so often, or we would say that a range of the conservation value can be between 30 and 60% of the total value of the property. So bear with me. So potentially, if you are in a really rural landscape where developers are not knocking on your door to, build a subdivision on your property, you're probably going to be on that lower side of value for the conservation easement. If you're in a really big residential area close to a city, there's a lot of land with really high conservation value, and those developers are knocking on your door and trying to buy it, to subdivide and build it out, then that value of the conservation easement is going to be greater. And so, these appraisals are theoretical in one way, because you never know for sure what a piece of property is actually going to sell for until it sells, because that's based on the market. But they do their best to really look at that context of how it relates to the landscape, what's around it, what has been happening in the market to property that's similar to yours, and then they come up with that estimation value. Next slide, please. And then essentially, with that conservation easement value, be it 30% of the total value or 60% of the total value, that becomes, you can claim it as a charitable gift if it meets all the requirements of the IRS. And then you can claim that deduction for up to 16 years, essentially, the year you record the easement, and then 15 years in addition, up to 50% of your adjusted gross income. And if it's farmland, the amount that can actually be claimed is 100%. So that's a pretty fantastic incentive as far as taxes. Of course, not everyone is in a tax bracket where this really benefits them. If your taxes are already really low, perhaps claiming that charitable deduction doesn't really add up to as much as you feel like your land is really worth. Perhaps what you really need is a tractor instead. And so in that case, maybe looking for a bargain sale or applying for a grant for some of the value of the easement, if not the entire amount, is the way to go. Just keep in mind that selling an easement is just way more competitive. Next slide, please.
Actually, I just want to hop in and add two things real quick. So talking about that tax deduction, where you can deduct up to 50% of your adjusted gross income for up to 60 years or 100% for farmers and ranchers, that is either until you've hit that 16-year threshold, or you have hit the full value of the conservation easement. So if, for simple math, let's say that the value of the conservation easement is $100,000 and my adjusted gross income, let's say it's $40,000. That first year, I can deduct up to 50% of my adjusted gross income, which would equal $20,000. The next year, I can do the same, another $20,000. but I can only continue those deductions until the full value, that $100,000 of the conservation easement, is met. And so that tax benefit, we always recommend, we can't advise you financially and, what your certain circumstances are. And so we always recommend that if you have the capacity to talk to someone who can guide you on that financially. It's certainly not a decision that works for everyone. And we 100% recognize that. The second thing I wanted to mention is that if you were to place a conservation easement on your property, if you were to go and then say, sell it 20 years down the line, this after easement encumbered fair market value, the blue column here, that number would change, right? Because real estate prices and appraisals are always variable depending on when that appraisal is done. So even though you have that paperwork and you know that that's what it was valued at the time, that isn't necessarily what the value of your property with an easement would be 20 years after placing it. So I just wanted to add those two quick things before we hit the next slide.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, those are really important points. And so just to talk about some different types of examples of properties that we have protected with conservation easements, you can have in an agricultural land easement. And so it's still with a focus on conservation, but it's recognizing that this is rural producer working land. So for example, you could have 400 acres and there's already an existing house and a barn, and perhaps the farmer is managing cattle, but also does some timber production and manages some hay fields and has some rotation with cows and hay. So what we commonly see is that sometimes children are not as interested in pursuing a future of farming, or sometimes one child is and maybe one child is moving away. So in this case, perhaps the tax benefits would benefit one of the inheritors enough that they could buy out a sibling, and then they could keep that land, and they're interested in protecting the property with the conservation easement. And maybe in the future, what we would design into the conservation easement in anticipating the future would be we were going to maintain those agricultural uses and then maybe have an option to build 2 more houses. Now, the reason why we bring up the children is because sometimes the owners of a property might feel very strongly that they want to pursue a conservation easement or protect land. And then when they discuss it with the folks that will be inheriting the land, they get a little pushback. Or sometimes a property is held in trust and there's multiple family members and maybe some are local and some are not. So in this sense, sometimes those tax benefits can help to buy out a family member, or sometimes applying for grants can help to buy out those family members that are not really as vested in maintaining the property. And then as far as anticipating those future scenarios, for example, the option to build 2 more houses. So if we have 400 acres, if that was subdivided under some of the rural laws that are out there for land protection, sometimes you can build a house per 20 acres or a house per 5 acres. And then in these rural landscapes, every one of those houses has a septic tank. And now we have a scenario where there's potentially a lot of nutrients and a real change from what was once mostly just some cows and hay fields and timber. And so that's in stark contrast to the idea of 400 acres with potentially 3 houses on it. However, with IRS law, we can't just say in a conservation easement, one day I might build 2 other houses out here. We actually have to be very specific. So it does require some kind of forecasting and planning ahead. Where would those houses go? What would be the footprint? How large of an area would it potentially impact? And then we would help the landowner with trying to minimize any impacts to the conservation value so that you aren't, in a sense, like designing something that's taking away from the value of the easement. So there are some pretty strict criteria related to that planning. It just means that it has to be specific. So it has to be well thought out before you kind of finalize that conservation easement. Next slide, please.
I just want to hop in and say, for this example, the scenario, just want to pull out and highlight some of the things that Erica just mentioned. One, it's protecting that legacy, right? 400-acre family farm. It's protecting not only the family's legacy, but also really securing the rural landscape and that scenic and open space and that use for future generations. Secondly, as Erica mentioned, it is resolving some potential family strife, right? It's really important for folks to think ahead down the line, and sometimes it's not always an option, but in this situation, you've removed a potential feud from your inheritors by saying, this is how the property is going to look, and this is financially the implications for both of you, while still having a viable farm for someone to potentially manage. And if it's purchased, having cash compensation for the other child. And it also is something that is permanent. It's running with the property forever, but it does have in some built flexibilities to make sure that if your kids want to, you can come back and live there. They can each build a house, but it really just preserves the integrity of that property. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. And so a very different example, we have coastal conservation easements. This is a pilot program where we worked with the University of Florida and the College for Law there. Usually when we're talking about protecting land and when we think about conservation easements, they are more typically on large tracts of land. Big conservation corridors. And of course, coastal property, because of its value, much of it is pretty developed, and usually those lots are quite small. And so we wanted to look at, could we protect these smaller coastal properties? Many of them already have an existing home. So you start thinking, well, where's that conservation value? But our project was really focused on sea turtle and shorebird conservation, where you have nesting habitat behind these homes next to natural dunes that could still have a lot of impacts if someone didn't manage their property in a way that benefits sea turtles and shorebirds. And so we came up with language for a conservation easement that looked at limitations related to things that you potentially could get a permit to do on your property in a coastal area. You could decide to build a dock or a seawall, or perhaps there would be lighting that would be bad for sea turtles, where they would disorient when they hatch from the nest. Now, in some areas, there are local code enforcement that maybe already says that you must protect sea turtles on your property, but because it's a conservation easement, it wouldn't be as vulnerable to changes of political will. In the state of Florida, we don't have statewide rules on sea turtle lighting. That's really a local ordinance. It's something that is maybe going to change, but right now it doesn't. And then we went a little further with this conservation easement and looked for ways for folks to be good stewards of sand dunes. So maybe they could do some planting if there's some kind of washover during a storm. They can keep trash off of the property so that it doesn't attract wildlife like raccoons that could potentially damage sea turtle nests. And so even though they're small lots, and these are not very dramatic conservation goals compared to, protecting completely natural areas, these properties are very valuable. So even a small percentage of value in the conservation easement could potentially be a pretty large tax incentive for some folks. I would say this one, the coastal properties, are particularly challenging for families because the properties are so valuable. But it's an interesting tool to try and address some of the gaps in sea turtle habitat protection where private landowners really can create corridors of safe nesting habitat for these species. Next slide, please. And then of course, there's maybe the more traditional natural area. Someone might have, lots of land that's completely natural, or perhaps there are a few homes on the property. Perhaps they even rent those homes. One thing that we see is folks can be very interested in preserving their right to hunt on the land, or they might even have hunting leases while they allow others to hunt on their land. These areas we would, of course, even encourage passive recreational use. Sometimes landowners are very engaged with their properties and do all kinds of stewardship where they are actively managing with prescribed fire, if that's appropriate, or they are doing timber harvests that are ecologically sound, or managing the property. But we can also connect landowners with resources. Alachua Conservation Trust has land management staff, and we have grants to help with landowner assistance with restoration of communities like longleaf pine and to do prescribed burning. We help develop management plans sometimes. And as well, we can connect landowners with available resources like working with the Fish and Wildlife, if you have listed species, or working with other agencies like county foresters if prescribed fire is something you'd like to do on your property. So, we're building a relationship, and our goal is to look at that future version of your property and make sure that it's able to be maintained as we had planned for in the conservation easement. Next slide, please. And so to kind of wrap up on this process, sometimes we do really targeted outreach, and sometimes landowners approach us. Word of mouth has also been a fantastic tool when we have a existing relationship with the landowner and they start to speak with their neighbors about what they're doing. But we like to meet with the landowner and really figure out what is their goal for the property. As I was speaking about, what is what do you intend during your lifetime, and then also past your lifetime? Will there be inheritors, or do you anticipate the property being sold? And what do you want to maintain? What do you want to make sure is protected? What are you willing to be flexible on? These types of things. And then we decide, is this a good tool? Can we come up with language that meets that criteria? We like to visit the property so that we really get a clear understanding of what's there. And then it's at that point where we start recommending that folks speak to a financial advisor or an attorney and make sure that this makes sense for you financially. And then we start to outline project costs. There are many items of due diligence that occur with any kind of real estate transaction, which is, at its very core, this is what that is. And so we do things like boundary surveys and ecological surveys to make sure that there's not some kind of unknown threat or contamination on the property. We need to make sure that the property has a clean title and that we can insure that title. And then potentially at this point, we're also looking for those funding sources and grants to apply for, trying to evaluate how your property might fit into existing grants. And then potentially a landowner might decide to look at appraisal value to get a sense of what the conservation easement is worth, even if we're not quite ready to close yet. And then we come up with the easement terms, and that's a matter of taking all of this information, this conversation, what we've learned from being on the property, and understanding about what you'd like to do with the property, and we start to draft the terms of the conservation easement. And so that is a process where we're essentially sharing that document back and forth and making edits and changes and basically coming to consensus of what the holder of the conservation easement is willing to allow to still maintain that purpose of the conservation easement, which is conservation, but then also have some flexibility to meet those needs that you have for the future of the property. And then essentially, when it's time to close on the conservation easement, we create what's called a baseline documentation report. And this basically becomes the photographic and written record of what the property looked like when we closed on the conservation easement. And then this becomes the basis for what we compare your property to moving forward. And so, you know, with a conservation easement comes the tools to be able to ensure that the terms of the conservation easement are maintained in perpetuity. We don't record conservation easements and then walk away. We maintain our relationships with the landowners, and typically at least once a year, we'll, you know, call ahead or send a letter and communicate with the landowner that it's time. And then we will go with our baseline documentation report and join the landowner and revisit the property and make sure that it, you know, it's where it should be in terms of that conservation easement. And then it's just also a really nice opportunity too to realize, like, oh, did you realize that there's some exotic species? You're not required to do anything about it, but we have resources that can assist you if you would like to do something about it that would benefit conservation. You know, we build relationships, and then, you know, because these are forever, you know, 50 years from now, Melissa and I probably will not be visiting your property, and perhaps somebody else will be owning your property. And so whoever is still doing that easement check still has that baseline documentation reports and understands what your intent was when we recorded this conservation easement, so that that is always maintained moving forward, no matter who owns the property in the future. And next slide. And so there are other tools for recording conservation easements. Certainly people include us in part of their planning for their estates through wills and bequests. Some folks opt to do enhanced life estates, where the conservation easement doesn't actually go into effect until after the landowner's passing. So we would create the conservation easement, agree to all the terms, but the landowner doesn't necessarily have to abide by the terms of the easement until, or they never do because they pass on, but the next owner will then have this conservation easement on their property. So there are some really interesting flexible tools for that life planning. Melissa, did you want to add anything about wills or bequests?
Also, we recognize, so a conservation easement is a very unique type of tool, and it doesn't work for every property and it doesn't work for every property owner, but there are some people who are just very extremely motivated to make sure that their property serves a conservation purpose long-term. So some of those other options, if it makes sense for each individual and family, is you can, you know, leave in your will your entire estate to a lateral conservation trust, even if it's perhaps not a natural area. We've had folks who have left us, you know, houses more in town with the intent that we can receive it and have the option to sell it and then put that money towards purchasing conservation lands. Or if you do have a natural property and you want to see that protected long term, it can also be, you know, put in your will. And it's always nice to know if we're getting put in someone's will. It's not something that has to happen, but it helps us plan and make sure that, you know, a will is a tool that is used specifically for planning purposes. And, you know, in that same line of thinking, it helps us if we can plan to make sure that we're good stewards of whatever resources you intend to help further land conservation in Florida. So there's a lot of other options. And we do have some folks on staff who are able to assist with talking through a bit more complicated legal arrangements as far as estate planning is concerned. So if you're interested in that, you can email us after. But next slide, Erica.
So this is the last slide. that was a lot of information, and you know, it is complex, but it is a process. And you know, the main take-home messages are that conservation easements can provide a peace of mind for you, for your family, to know that a property will be protected forever, and they can be highly customized and personalized on the front end to make sure that it is meeting your goals for the property, as long as there is this public benefit of wildlife, open spaces, and protecting the environment. And when I say public benefit, I don't mean public access. I just mean that in terms of, you know, protecting wild spaces, open spaces, rural areas, and the environment is good for everybody. And then of course there can be this personal benefit as well in terms of a tax deduction and family planning. And so with that, if you are interested, we have all kinds of literature that we can share, and we can have a conversation, or if you have questions, I think it's probably time for those. Last slide is just our thank you slide. So thank you.
Yep. And that's our contact information. Feel free to write that down. You can also call that number at the bottom. That's our office phone number, and we can connect you to the right person through that. I'm going to pose a last question for everyone to answer on the polls, and Heather can get organized while folks are answering that. So hang tight. All right, the question for everyone is, or I guess it's more of an agreement with the statement, is after this workshop, would you, between agreed and strongly disagree, I have a clear understanding of conservation easements. So you can go anywhere between strongly disagree, neither disagree or agree, very neutral, or somewhere in the agree range. We'll give about 15 more seconds to folks to chime in. So it's really helpful to us to know how we're doing communicating and making sure that we explain these topics well to people who are interested in conservation easements and the programs we have as a whole. All right, gonna go ahead and close it, but it looks like the majority of people, 18% said they strongly agree, 76% say they agree that they have an understanding of conservation easements, and then 6% of people neither disagree or agree. So I'm gonna go ahead and close that, and thank you all for participating. All right, Heather?
Thank you so much, ladies. That was a very informative presentation on conservation easements, and I'm always learning something new from both of you as well. So thank you so much. We have some great questions coming in, and don't worry, I am seeing them. If I haven't responded to you, I see them coming in, and we're going to try to get through as many as we can. First and foremost, we've got a couple of questions that actually came in earlier today before the presentation. I want to make sure we cover them. And I'm sorry if you guys did mention this in your talk, but I think it's worth repeating. The first question is there a minimum size for a conservation easement? So, you know, we have smaller preserves that we manage, which are technically not an easement, but actually a public preserve. And they're less than, say, 2 acres. Is that something that you could put a conservation easement on?
I can hop in. So, you know, the federal and the state rule for conservation easements is they have to meet the minimum conservation values. And so typically conservation values of being pieces of land that are, you know, very scenic, open space, have that aesthetic, either working agricultural lands, have really important natural areas. Maybe they're an important buffer for a river, a tributary, they have wetlands on the property. And so a lot of times, you know, that is associated with large acreages. However, it is not unreasonable to have smaller acreages considered for conservation easements. I will say that according to state tax codes, if you have less than 40 acres, you have to meet an additional requirement to qualify for that income tax deduction. So there is a bit more of extra conversations that have to happen around that. A great example is the coastal conservation easements that Erica was talking about. Those properties are usually very small in size, you know, sometimes less than an acre, but they can qualify because they have such an important nesting component for endangered and threatened species, specifically sea turtles and shorebirds. But if there's something that you're not sure about, kind of the best place to start is really to reach out to one of us and talk through your property together. And we'll have a pretty good idea at the end of a conversation if it's something that should be pursued.
Great. And our next question, we actually got this a few times, so I'm going to roll some of these into one question. Is public access a required component of a conservation easement? And then there was a second question that was kind of like, what role does ACT play into the management of the land that's under the easement? So it's kind of a two-pronged question, but we've got a few people that asked that.
This is definitely a very common question. I think that some of it stems around the term easement, because easements mean a lot of different things and there are different types of easements. And so specifically when we're speaking about conservation easements with a land trust, even with a public agency, you are maintaining private ownership. The land stays in private property, period. It's not public land. There's no public access. So potentially if someone is requiring public access, it could just be like a different type of scenario. Perhaps there's a public agency that this is a term of the way that they do things, so that's something that's negotiated. But typically, no, it is private property, it is your property. And so that means that we also don't just have the right to just show up anytime that we want. That's why we coordinate with the landowner and make sure when it's time to do that inspection that they know that we're coming. So this isn't the same thing as like an access easement, maybe for like a utility or something like that. So that's often some confusion there. And then as far as like the day-to-day management, there are many terms in the conservation easement that give a landowner the right to manage their property, but not necessarily the requirement. So we don't really have a right to harvest timber on your property, or, I don't know what the various scenarios might potentially be, but it's private property. We don't get to make money off of your property or manage your property. But what we do is, if the landowner is interested, is that we can connect to resources that can assist with landowner management. So there could be options for restoration, for enhancement, for doing things like prescribed fire or exotic species removal, if that is something that the land manager wants to do. We can make recommendations, we can assist, and we can connect to resources.
I will just add in there for that first part of the question regarding access for the public. I have worked on an easement where the landowner had a very large tract of land and they wanted to have a small portion of their property as a hiking trail for their neighbor to be able to come in and walk through. So you can allow public access, but that's only if you want to. There's by no means an obligation. It's your property, as Erica said, it's your right to decide. And so if you would like to include that in the easement for some reason, you see a benefit for trail connectivity, or, somewhere in the future, it's just something you see being a part of your land, then it can be included, but that's not standard language that we typically include in our kind of draft easement for folks that we work off of.
So our next question is a little bit specific to the person who's asking. It says, I live in Seminole County in Central Florida and am interested in strategizing about how I can help my grandmother, who's 95, conserve the natural state of her land. Is this something that ACT could help with, or is there a more local agency in the area that I could talk to?
I can go ahead and take that one. And so to talk about, I'm actually going to bring back up our working map. Hopefully this will load. Here we go. So as I mentioned earlier, this is ACT's primary working area. And as Erica was talking about coastal conservation easements, we do hold easements outside of this area. I also mentioned something earlier about how there's over 1,000 land trusts in the entire United States. So Today, if you're joining us from somewhere else in Florida, really far outside this region, or even, Idaho, there are land trusts that work in your region. Specifically in the state of Florida, there's actually multiple land trusts that work in the state, and everyone has essentially a core geographic region. And so if you maybe aren't living, or your property isn't specifically in this working area, if you want to email Erica or I, or give our office a phone call and talk about where you live, we could be happy to direct you to the most appropriate land trust to help you with that. But as I mentioned, for folks who maybe are joining us that don't live in the state of Florida, we've had quite a few people tune in on webinars that, have heard of us over the years, but don't necessarily live in the state. You can go to the Land Trust Alliance website. Which if you just Google Land Trust Alliance, it'll pop up. But they have a platform to help direct you to local land trusts in different states. So you can also visit that as a resource if you're a little further away than Seminole County. But for that person, please email us. We'd be happy to connect you.
Great. Our next question is, does ACT require a conservation easement management endowment from the property owner to cover the actual costs of maintaining or enforcing the easement?
So that is a great question. And the answer for that is yes. So with a conservation easement, and that, kind of nice flow chart that Erica showed earlier, there's different steps and different times where you're summing up all of the associated costs for doing a conservation easement. Part of that is the due diligence, which includes that qualified appraisal, the boundary survey, things of that nature, but also the endowment for the conservation easement. And when I say endowment, those funds go into a designated account. It's not something that ACT or any other entity that has that endowment can just take in and out as they want. It's restricted funds specifically for that property, for that easement. And those funds are used for the long-term oversight and management, management's a poor word choice, oversight and visitation of that property to make sure that the terms of that conservation easement are upheld long-term. So part of that are, the yearly visits to come out and see the property and to meet with the landowner. Part of that is if a baseline documentation report, that living photo and Word document needs to get updated at some point. And also part of it too is insurance. So, Alachua Conservation Trust, if something were to happen to the easement, not even necessarily by fault of the landowner, that fund can be used to help litigate if necessary, which is a very, very rare occurrence. But because it's a permanent document, you have to cover all your bases, and that is a part of that type of responsibility.
Thank you. And to kind of dovetail on that question, is there a typical estimate that we typically see at ACT for outside legal costs associated with setting up an easement?
So that's a great question. And in that process, we can take a look and work to estimate those types of costs that would come from you seeking legal advice or financial advice, as well as due diligence, and of course, estimate, that long-term endowment. But I will say it's something that varies a lot for each property. Particularly, if you're asking us to estimate legal costs, that's not necessarily something that we would do. We could, speak through you in reasonable terms, but if it's a split ownership and there's, maybe 5 different family members, and there's a lot of kind of cleanup that has to happen before pursuing an easement, that could cost something substantial. But we're always willing to talk through that in advance and give people a heads up of, where areas of expenses would come from on projects. But we typically see appraisals running, around similar figures, unless it's a very complicated property with lots of different aspects to it. Boundary surveys are also usually pretty all similar, unless, of course, there's always the caveats of, there's maybe some contention on the boundary with a neighboring landowner, or if you live on a river and there's a lot of fluctuation as to where that kind of shoreline is. So those are variable based on the property. And then, the legal consulting fees, I would say those are variable based on the landowner.
Our next question is, can a conservation easement be amended later on? For example, when the property changes hands?
They are designed not to be amended. And specifically to qualify for the IRS code and those requirements related to the purpose of the easement, no, they cannot be amended. So that is why we work really hard to think about those future scenarios and kind of anticipate the family's needs while we're designing the conservation easement. And there have been in the past conservation easements that were designed more flexibly. And that's just to say that those conservation easements wouldn't qualify under the same types of rules. So they're harder to enforce, they're harder to litigate on. They just don't really have the teeth that we standardly would use to make sure that a property is protected in perpetuity. And if you don't mind, Heather, I'll tag onto that. I noticed the question about when conservation easements might be threatened by some kind of eminent domain, like a turnpike or a pipeline. That is also a really common question and something that we actually do have some experience with. So when it comes to eminent domain, it's certainly challenging, and we couldn't say that a conservation easement would definitely prevent that governmental taking. But we can say that we've had experience where a property was protected with a conservation easement that was supposed to have this able pipeline going through it. And so we were able to act on behalf of the conservation easement and submit documentation and essentially helped the government decide perhaps this is not the best route, and that pipeline went around the property. So it aided in that decision making, but it's not a guarantee. So that is true.
Thank you. You got two questions in one, so that's very helpful. Okay, so let's see. We've got some great questions still coming in. Please do keep sending them. We've got until 7:30 this evening if we need it. So the next question is, have you done any conservation easements for aquifer recharge or groundwater quality? So easements that protect those two things.
I can go for that. So as an organization, we have a couple of programs that are running concurrently that really allow us to focus in on watershed health. So looking at springs health and drinking water protection. So talking about aquifer, as you mentioned. And that certainly plays into conservation easements. It is a part of the conservation value, particularly for this area in Florida. You know, Florida has, I think, close over 1,000 springs. And in our working area, we have the Santa Fe River and the Swanee River, which are just gloriously laden with springs, so many of them. And so part of what we do when we are discussing the conservation value of the property is we look at the entire landscape. So not just what's directly on site, you know, maybe it has some really great longleaf pine forest out there, or it has beautiful scenic open space. But we also look at how it connects to our drinking water. For us in Florida, that's really important to consider. And so we will take mapping tools and data layers, and we'll look at how much it connects to the aquifer, how high that connectivity is, as well as see where it sits in a couple of different planning mechanisms for the state to protect springs and watershed quality. And so we will definitely highlight that in the easement language itself, as well as in the baseline documentation. We also, under those different programs, we're looking specifically to work with properties that have high connections to aquifer recharge and to Springs Health. And if there is a really direct corollary, that can help a property owner if donating is not an option, to potentially help secure grant funding. So as we mentioned earlier, funding to purchase conservation easements is very competitive. And there's only a few outlets for it that have, very high standards. And something that a lot of those standards align with are how it can protect drinking water, as well as, working landscapes and natural areas. So it's something we definitely consider and we take into consideration as far as our programs go. But it's for valuation standards, it's not necessarily something that would increase the value of the easement beyond a traditional appraisal. And what I mean by that is, even if a property has very high aquifer recharge, that's something that we value as a conservation organization, but it might not necessarily reflect the highest and best use of the property. Just something to consider. Thank
you, Melissa. So I'm going to take two questions, kind of put them together because they're kind of along the same vein. But how does ACT handle non-compliance with the intent of a conservation easement? And also to dovetail on that, what are some of the issues that ACT has encountered before with existing conservation easements and compliance issues?
I mean, first and foremost, we build relationships with our landowners. We want to make sure that we design an easement appropriately and that we really have the foresight to plan for the future, make sure that it's a document that is enforceable. And so if there becomes an issue that's really in violation of the intent of the conservation easement, the very first thing that we would do is talk to the landowner. We would look for mechanisms to try and fix and address the issue together. I would say that none of our conservation easements are older than 20 years at this point, if that's accurate, Melissa. And so, as of right now, we really don't have too many conservation easements that have changed a lot of hands. I think that where you start running into the potential for the terms of the conservation easement being violated would potentially be with new landowners. There's language in the conservation easements that if a property is going to be sold, Electoral Conservation Trust has the right of first refusal. And then also that we coordinate directly with the new owner to make sure that they understand the terms of the conservation easement and what they are beholden to under those terms. So if there's this really gross violation, as Melissa was speaking about with the endowment, and it looks like there is not a path to address it, then we have that insurance to pursue litigation. And that's related to that endowment and making sure that we can protect the property as it was meant to be protected in perpetuity. We've never had to do that, but we have that tool available to us if it came to that.
You mentioned mining rights early on. How does mining or mineral rights factor into the discussion related to conservation?
So interesting. So, there are actually mines in existence that have been retired that have really direct connections to our aquifer and to our drinking water that the state has purchased and is protecting, because now it's been kind of enhanced or restored and provides habitat. And so that's kind of its own thing that has to be in really vulnerable areas. That's something really specific. Where we encounter mining in terms of what I was speaking about is related to the rights of property owners. So as a property owner, you own the right to subdivide, to sell, to develop, and those are the rights you're giving up. Along with that, we also try and retire any mining rights. Sometimes what people don't always realize is that there could be these really sometime in the past, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, somebody sold the mining rights on your property. And you may not even be completely aware of them. So that's why title reports are so important. We do our due diligence to make sure that we have a clear title. And then when we find those mining rights, if they're really old and were never renewed, then we can extinguish them usually with our attorneys. Sometimes if they're active, we'll look for ways to extinguish them. And essentially we're trying to make sure that the terms of the mining rights do not undermine the protection of the property and our ability to meet the purpose of the conservation easement. So, so if there were mining rights and there was a real threat that someone might actually come in and dig up your property for phosphate, then it would be it would be in violation of the conservation easement, but that would be rights that they own. And so that's why we have to be clear on what the mining rights are and then try and address them and make sure that they wouldn't be in conflict with the purpose of the easement.
Great question and answer. Thank you, Erica. So the next question, I think this is a really good question. Thank you. It's how does sea level rise figure in for coastal easements? And also, what about damage due to hurricanes or flooding?
I can take that if you want, Melissa. So with a conservation easement, if there's no longer any property to protect, if a property got completely wiped out, it makes it really hard, you know, that your property rights, if something's just literally gone, you know, it's nobody's fault and it's just, you know, a natural disaster. So potentially that could, you know, undermine our ability to enforce the terms of a conservation easement. But we also know in the long game, with storms, with hurricanes, coastlines are shifting all the time. You can have accretion, or you can have sand loss. You can have, you know, habitat loss. We do work with landowners to find opportunities to do enhancement, to do habitat, to try and keep it intact. And potentially in a conservation easement, there would, you know, we wouldn't prohibit the ability for someone to protect their property as long as the purpose of the easement is maintained. So a seawall would not be part of the purpose of the easement if we're trying to protect sea turtle habitat. So that wouldn't be a good option if a property was protected with a conservation easement and you were concerned about hurricanes and sea level rise. So we do look for stewardship opportunities in that sense. And we have protected properties that have been impacted by hurricanes and help to find resources to help do some restoration of dune vegetation and some plantings. And those projects have responded well. But it is a concern. Conservation easements can be tools related to sea level rise when we're looking for corridors for migration of native species, of plants. This is something that I think is definitely in the forefront in the Gulf side of Florida right now, especially in the Big Bend area, where folks are looking for ways to allow for marsh migration. When you're talking about a really narrow beach, like in St. Johns County, where you have, you know, homes in between A1A and the beach, it certainly becomes more challenging. And again, it's just something that we look at a case-by-case instance and determine if a conservation easement is the right tool for that property.
So we've got 2 more questions. We're going to try to get to both of those before we wrap up this evening. The first question is, how long does it typically take to enter into a discussion, perform due diligence, and craft the easement language to actually close out the agreement, assuming that this is a married couple with no children and no other entanglements?
I can take that one. So I would say there are 2 timelines to consider. One is if you're donating, and the second one is if you're trying to sell the conservation easement. So I'll address the donating one first. I would say if you are very motivated, you know exactly what you would like in that conservation easement, and we are able to get the appropriate due diligence done. It could be done anywhere, I'd say, between 6 to 8 months. However, If there's a lot of back and forth on that conservation easement, you're not sure, you know, really what the implications are. There's a lot of conversations that, you know, are maybe beyond our organization's control, like your conversations with your lawyer or financial advisor. It could take longer. If you are looking to sell a conservation easement, those timelines are heavily dictated by the grant programs that we pursue. And we don't get to make those timelines, sadly. So those timelines can run from application. So you're looking at the program, you're considering it, you're getting everything in, to decision period, to you get your money, and then you've closed on the easement. That can take up to 2 years. And so, you know, what I like to tell people is this tool is forever. It doesn't mean that the process should take forever, but it will take a bit of time. So this isn't something to be rushed into by any means. But, you know, ACT does treat each project with timeliness, and we work really hard to keep things moving on the behalf of the landowner.
And our last question this evening is, oh, we got another one that just came in. I know you guys can answer this one fast. So does ACT accept direct donations of land?
Yes, we do. And if you'd like to ask specifically about how to do that, or to even have someone come out and take a look at the property, please call our office or email one of us, and we can help you with that.
Great. And then the very last question, sorry, I can't take any more after this. What determines if a property should continue to be held by the owner versus just donating the land to the trust or the nonprofit outright?
So that's a great question. And I think that that's a conversation that really happens at the beginning of this type of inquiry. So if you have a property that you want to see have long-term conservation, that's something where we go out and we look at the property and we talk to you and your family and we figure out what your long-term goals are. And if it's something that you want to have continued private ownership of, where, you know, it's your property to manage, you get to come out and your kids can inherit it down the line, a conservation easement would be likely a good tool for you. If you're looking, you just love that property, maybe you don't want to manage it long term, you know, you don't have a house on the property, or even if you do, but you just really want to see it protected no matter what, then that's a good case for ACT to have the full property outright. We own it, we manage it. And, you know, oftentimes if people make that type of donation, we work with that individual to make sure that the long-term goal is still met. So if you meet with a landowner who wants to donate it completely, you know, ACT would own and manage it, and they really want to make sure that it has hiking trails for birding, we work with the property owner to make sure that happens. If they want it to have interpretive signs of trees out there so people can learn their trees or appreciate that, we work with the property owner to have that happen long-term as well. So, but as always, a conversation is a nice place to start on that. So.
Thank you. And thank you both to Melissa and Erica for joining us this evening and having this very informative discussion on conservation easements. Thank you for everybody who participated in the question and answer and said some excellent questions. If we didn't answer your question or you're looking for more information, please feel free to reach out to us. All of our emails are online at www.alachuaconservationtrust.org. You can also just use the contact us form and we'll get that inquiry as well. So please feel free to reach out if you'd like to learn more, or if you'd like to share this webinar with someone else who's looking to learn more about conservation easements. You can do that on our YouTube page. And lastly, I'd just like to invite everybody to join us for our next online program. And it's a little different than what we've been doing. We are going to have our annual holiday mingle virtually this year to keep everybody safe. And we'd love for you to join us. It's on December 18th. It starts at 6:30. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then we'll resume our normal Keep Florida Wild series webinars in January again. But please sign up for our holiday mingle. We would love to have you join us for that event. And thank you again for joining us. It's 7:30. So I wish everybody a wonderful rest of their evening, and we will see you on December 18th.